close the program. So try again. Fortunately, the only file that we lost there was the textured room, which is not super important. Okay, so texture. Painting texture by hand. I'm going to do this in grayscale so that it applies to people who are drawing. So let's say that you've got a ball that you've drawn and you've shaded it. Oops. And now you want to add texture. So most texture is going to appear in the midtone area, especially close to the terminator, because that is where light and dark are interplaying the most. So if you want to do fur, you're going to start by drawing the holes in between the fur, which is going to end up looking like a bunch of V shapes. I'm assuming that you're working with charcoal here or something where you can go over with a lighter color. But if not, it's not the end of the world, it's going to look a little different. With the texture getting less and less noticeable as we get toward the highlight, and even less noticeable as we get into the shadow. Coming back with a light color, white charcoal or whatever. We're going to start painting over, sketching over, and adding in the highlights. This is the clumps of fur that are visible rather than the holes between them. And unfortunately, there's no special secret to painting fur. It is literally just hair by hair, practicing until it looks right. I've tried and tried everything I can to find a shortcut to painting hair. You can get down a good base layer with a fur brush, but it's not going to look right unless you go over it hair by hair. Generally, you want to start out with very small shapes, or very big shapes rather, and then work up towards your small hairs. So the clumps first, and then the individual hairs over top, the brightest color. And if you're working in color, you want to make sure you get some variation in there. Fur is not all one solid color. There's a lot of different little colored hairs in there. Excuse me. If you're working with a manga studio, I find you can do wonders with a soothing watercolor brush in terms of creating a quick furry effect. Just push it back and forth. But again, nothing is going to compare to actually sitting there and drawing out every hair. A lot of you are probably not going to be looking for hyper-realism, at least not at this point, so, you know, shortcuts like using a soothing watercolor tool or a blunting stump or whatever are totally fine. But if you're wanting realism, it's going to take a lot of work. And, you know, there's lots of tutorials out there, brushes that claim to tell you that they can teach you how to draw fur, but all of the good ones basically just come down to do it hair by hair and have a lot of patience. See if my studio crashes on me while we're saving this time. Hooray! What about curly fur? Again, just study your references. You know, it's going to be a slightly different shape. It's going to be obviously more curly. Specifically more wavy, with the loose hairs being very frizzy looking. But, it's definitely something you just have to reference in order to get it right. There's no trick. I know that's really disappointing to hear, because everybody's like, oh, I want to learn how to draw fur, I want to do the fur brush, and want to instantly be able to have it look realistic, but unfortunately that's just not how it works. The best way to learn anything is going to be through doing studies. Pull up photos, pull up live, or, you know, dead, if you're working with animal parts, like furs and skulls and whatnot. References, and just study the heck out of them. Do little short gestures, do longer, more involved studies, but just do a lot of studies in your spare time, and that'll build up your mental library of what things look like and how to draw them. Okay, we still got half an hour left to kill, so questions. Anything you guys want to learn about, just throw it at me and I will try to teach. Eyes, okay, I can do that. I'm going to be working with human style eyes here. For references to animal eyes, please see your references. Okay, so, well, the first thing to realize is that the eyeball is in fact a ball. You only see part of it through the eyelid, but it is a curved surface nevertheless that protrudes somewhat from the eyelids. The colors which make up the eye are actually more or less on a flat plate, a dished plate inside the eye, with the pupil being an opening and the iris being muscles. And then this area is, you know, the cornea and the lens and all that. This is really rusty anatomy, but, you know, I'm doing the best I can. So, when you're shading an eye, you know, for stylistic purposes, you can make the pupil whatever color you want, but it really should always, if you're doing realism, it should always be black. Because it is a hole into the eye. Unless, you know, going for a red eye effect or whatever when the light reflects off of the back of the eyeball. So you go about shading an iris very similarly to the way you would go about shading a gem, where if the light source is coming from here, the shadow is largely going to be the drop shadow caused by the shape of the eye and the eyelid, with the brightest part of the eye being opposite the light source, with the exception of the specular, which will be, again, bouncing off us at a right angle to the light source. Or not bouncing off us, bouncing off the eye. And you can add wet lines underneath and stuff too. I did a long tutorial on eyes at one point, but I can go real quick here and do a rough version again. Don't forget the tear duct. Make this eye blue. Very rough. So we have the shadow coming down as a drop shadow from the eyelid. We have the main highlight being opposite that. And you know, excuse me, on the cornea of the eye there are shadows as well. Most of the drop shadows, but also a little curved shadow as well from the form shadow from the shape of the eyeball. Oops. And then specular, I like to do by drawing a line, blurring out the bottom half of it. That is the wrong blur. Blurring out the bottom half of it, and then adding a little burst, starburst or whatever, because usually my images are set outside. The light is going to be the shape of the light source. The highlight, specular. And, you know, if you want to get fancy, the iris actually has all kinds of striations in it, which are the shapes of the muscles that are used to contract and expand the pupil. But yeah, so if we had a window being the light source, then the highlight would be shaped like a window, the specular would be, and so on. And if you're doing more realistic eyes, keep in mind that eyes are generally not all one color. The striations tend to be in a lot of different tones. And you know, there's things like heterochromia, iridem, and central heterochromia, and all that.